Hey everyone, Phreak here. It's time for the patch 8.17 rundown. I don't believe this patch has almost any significance for pro play. 8.19 will be the world's patch, not 8.18, which I believe I said last time, so I was wrong there. But essentially what my understanding is, 8.17 is somewhat of a solo queue patch. 8.18 will be pretty much the first pass of the world's patch, where they're going to do all the balance that they want to do for worlds. And then in case something was screwed up, they pick the number too high or too low, they'll do tune-ups in 8.19, and that'll be the world's patch. Amidst all of this, though, there should still be updates for solo queue champions, things like Garen that aren't really played in pro, Shaco, etc. So that kind of stuff will be happening. Either way, I'm pretty excited for Worlds coming up. I'm pretty excited for preseason when that happens around 22 or something, and that'll be exciting. So 8.17 is a fairly small patch. Let's try to get through it. And that's a cool little video. Nexus Blitz is an update. There's an article about it. They added some new features. They added another new item. They do some more champion balance. That's all pretty cool. Nunu and Willump rework. That's going to be pretty cool. Seems pretty exciting. Champion Spotlight's out already. You can watch that as well. Either way, it looks pretty sweet. All right, so first up is changes to Annie. Annie's getting 50 attack range. She used to have it way back in the day. I was happy to see it gone as someone who did not play very much Annie, but played against Annie quite a lot. I always found this very annoying. And Annie is actually a fairly high win rate champion, so I am a little surprised that they think she needs buffs, but oh well. There's a chance it actually brings Annie back into competitive just because she can be a bit more of a lane bully and still has pretty good engage tools with Flash Tibbers. Either way, I didn't find this necessary, but it's not going to break the bank. Next up is buffs to Bard. Now, Bard's also in a pretty strong spot. Solo queue win rate wise, he's almost at 52%, which is pretty solid. He's getting 20 to 10 seconds off of his R cooldown, which is not massive, but does exist. So here's the math here, 15 to 10%. Cool, congrats. Nothing too shocking. Of course, keep in mind that supports don't level very quickly, so you're getting this 20 seconds off the cooldown for most of your time playing the game. So the buff is bigger in the real world than it is on paper. Either way, Bard's one of my favorite supports. He's a really cool champion. Happy to get buffs, but I also don't think he needs them. Next up are buffs to Fiora's early game. E is an ability that you max second, and it's 20% on the ability for levels 2 through 7, and then slowly trickles down over time, whatever. Here's the math. This is just her total attack damage as a basic champion using E, and it's just the second hit for the ability. I didn't include both hits. I didn't feel like you needed to include both hits. So 14% more damage. Always, regardless of how much attack damage you have, it's always 14% because it's just a pure damage conversion. Eventually, again, tapering down to 0 at level 13, but hey, a pretty substantial bump to her early game. It's 14 damage at rank 1, still 13 damage in the mid game and whatnot, so it is a meaningful uptick in damage, so that's kind of cool. And at least Fiora wasn't super OP. She was just barely sub 50 win rate, so I think, okay to give her some buffs. That's fine. I think Fiora is a cool champion. I do want to see her exist as a counter to things like Aatrox, as a counter to tanks in general. I still like that we see tanks in-game. I don't think we really want a metagame that is 0 tanks, but increasingly the most common compositions are becoming triple tank. We're seeing like Olaf and Sejuani and Gragas jungle. We're seeing a lot more things like Mundo in the top lane, and a lot of Braum and Tahm Kench support. So anyone that's kind of an anti-tank I think is good. I think getting those champions nudged up slightly is a positive, so that's kind of cool. Next up, buffs to Garen. Garen is an exceptionally high win rate champion overall, and he is still above 50% in Diamond Plus, so I think Garen is definitely deserving of nerfs. Very worthy that happens. Either way, it's just 20 damage off max rank Q, tapering up from there. So here is the damage difference. Assuming you max Q first, which by the way is absolutely the correct skill order right now. And you can see it's a solid 5% damage cut by the mid game. Of course, there is still an attack damage ratio on this ability, and Garen is certainly going to buy things like Black Cleaver or Trinity Force or whatever. So he is not going to see numbers quite this bad in the real world. Either way, it's 20 damage off his full combo at most, which is never quite that insane. Garen will definitely remain above 50%. I think he will remain with Q max as well. Either way, Garen's going to remain strong, and he's probably going to remain above 50% in Diamond Plus as well. So enjoy your continued free low with Garen. Next up, small buffs to Aurelia. Now her Q is a full double damage to minions, which is quite nice. She was slightly sub 50% win rate overall. That said, she's still a fairly difficult champion to play, and so I think this is a champion that can rest sub 50, being that she's not been out for even a year yet. So I didn't think she really needed buffs. She's already even seeing pro play. This felt a bit unnecessary. This has been somewhat of a trend, I feel like, me calling a lot of these changes unnecessary. But either way, going from 1.7x to 2x, it's about an 18% bump in damage. So her Blade Surge does 18% more damage to minions. That's the buff. It's going to make resets easier. It's going to make last hitting easier. She's going to gain some win rate. She'll probably rest above 50% next patch. And again, I didn't feel like she really needed it. So we'll see what happens. Next up, buffs to Kassadin. I love Kassadin. I think he's one of my favorite mid laners. I really like this champion quite a lot. Aurelia too, for what it's worth, but I really like Kassadin. Early game buffs are quite nice. I'm always a little afraid of Riftwalk having a shorter cooldown at early ranks, because if he's ever not behind end level 6, suddenly he's unkillable. This continues to help his unkillable status. Kassadin was an above 50% win rate champion, just barely. He's also considered a counter pick into LeBlanc. LeBlanc is getting a bit popular as well, so it felt like Kassadin was in a roughly viable spot. Didn't seem to be needing buffs in solo queue, but maybe I'm missing something. And either way, had his niche in pro, will now more so have his niche in pro. Here is the math on Kassadin's Riftwalk cooldown. A solid 17 or 12% off for most of the game. Of course, 16 and onwards, which is the last 10% of the game. Yes, it's now the same, but this is a fairly substantial buff. Now, certainly, he's going to be mana pool gated and can't just Riftwalk forever, you know, in normal cases, but I think this is still fairly meaningful in terms of surviving his laning phase and having teamfight impact. Overall, again, I didn't think it was super necessary, but that said, I don't think these buffs are all that big, so I don't think he's going to become a problem. So I can't really complain. Next up, buffs to Kayn. Kayn getting some non-damage increases. They're basically buffing a bunch of the sort of squishy melees or semi-squishy melees. Master Yi's getting buffs later on in the patch, as you can see. So getting 2 seconds on his Shadow Step duration at rank 1. Of course, it's an ability that you will almost always max last, so you're getting a solid 40% bump in duration for the vast majority of the game, which is really, really, really substantial. Kayn was sitting at about 50%, 50.5 win rate in solo queue right now, which means he's going to be obviously much higher than that. Shadow Step duration is not all that important. Keep in mind the duration is cut to only 1 second when you are in combat. You're going to often jump out of the wall early in a lot of cases, so you're not getting this the whole time. This is a much smaller buff in the real world than it is on paper, in my opinion. Maybe I'm wrong about that, but that's how I feel. Overall, yeah, I feel like he didn't need this, but it's also not a huge deal. So Kayn players can be happy, I suppose. As far as this math's concerned, it does seem like, as far as win rates are concerned, I know Riot has the ability to easily track blue versus red Kayn win rates. I'm assuming blue Kayn was on the weak side compared to red Kayn, so they're bumping the move speed on this by 10%, which is in the real world about 5% more move speed in actuality, and in the real world even less than that because of diminishing returns. But hey, cool to see buffs. If Blue Kayn is indeed weak. Next up, buffs to Master Yi. Master Yi is roughly balanced, is probably okay to buff as a champion. A very low win rate mid laner, an acceptable jungler. They obviously did a bunch of Master Yi nerfs to try to curb funneling. At the end of the day, they had to just simply do actual funneling changes. You could argue they could have reverted all the Master Yi nerfs from way back when, but they didn't. Instead, they're buffing his defensive tools, and I think it's okay. In general, I am a fan of trying to round out the egregious cases of hyperscaling, Master Yi being one of them. Finding ways to make Master Yi less of a pub stomper and more well-rounded as a champion feels like good design direction to me, and so I like that their buffs are non-offensive. So Meditate getting a 20% cut to its cooldown, going from 35 to 28, and the damage reduction is actually a pretty substantial bump right here. Old damage reduction versus new damage reduction. and the column on the far right is how much damage can he take before dying, and it's 125% as much damage. So he's 25% more durable with Meditate for the first 13 levels, eventually tapering off towards 0, but still, that is a fairly substantial buff, even though it looks fairly small on paper. 50 to 70 becomes 60 to 70, doesn't seem that big. Trust me, it's a very, very, very big deal. So substantial durability increase as a result of this. He's taking 20% less damage than before, and his cooldown is 20% lower than before. Pretty substantial buffs to Meditate. This is a skill that requires skill to use. You've got to time it well and pick your moments to meditate the damage or a turret shot or whatever else, but certainly going to be better tower diver, going to be better at surviving like a Zed or an Aurelia all-in, things like that. So he's going to get quite some positives out of this. Next up is Rengar, another champion that is sitting above 50% win rate. Thus, I don't really think needs the buffs that much, but 20 to 0 seconds off his ultimate cooldown. Here's the numbers right there, a solid 15, and then 10, and then 0% off the cooldown. Yeah, I mean, these are pretty useful. Certainly getting more ults off can feel pretty good as Rengar. Doesn't really seem to be pro viable, at least not considered to be that. Maybe he really is, but they're not playing it. More ults means that he can do Rengar things more often, which actually I think is a good buff that pushes pro a bit more than it pushes solo queue. Either way, Rengar's pretty strong in solo queue, will remain strong in solo queue. Have fun. Next up, 50 health off of Varus, but 3 more health growth. Varus is considered a strong laner in pro play, and I think just it is a strong laner in general. They recently buffed his rank 1 W damage by quite a lot. He's obviously got pretty good range. Yeah, I mean, overall, he is a very strong early game champion. People are still figuring out his builds, but they're kind of settling on just a couple that are really viable. So that's kind of interesting as well, just like people have the option of playing multiple different Varus builds. But essentially, being that Varus is long-ranged and pretty poke-heavy, lower health I think is reasonable. And I am a little sad that this is not just a flat 500 instead of being 499. It doesn't really matter, but I feel like, you know, you could have just picked a round number just to do it. Whatever, not the end of the world. But because of the health growth difference, he eventually reaches the same numbers at level 18, but otherwise quite a bit squishier in the early game. Now keep in mind, he's going to have a health potion, and he's going to have a Doran's Blade in most of his lane matchups, so his actual health is like 60 or so higher. But, you know, definitely going to be squishier to the tune of 50 health. Obviously, it tapers off by the end of the game. But will be more bullyable in lane. The chance of killing him in an all-in or poking him out of lane is going to be more viable, so Varus' laning phase is weaker. Now, Varus is already a sub 50% win rate champion in solo queue, and maybe that is people doing wrong builds and not, you know, properly optimizing him. That's totally possible. Either way, Varus is a pretty high tier pro pick, at least in some regions like North America. Sure, being a weaker laner means we'll see less Varus, and that's fine. Next up, buffs to Wukong. Wukong is a 49.5 win rate champion overall in solo queue, according to stats that I saw. He is roughly balanced in solo lanes and slightly weak in the jungle. So 8% bonus attack speed at level 1 gives you this as far as his DPS. Keep in mind, attack speed is a really, really, really valuable stat in the jungle because you're obviously auto-attacking constantly. You have a ton of damage on hit with how Machete works right now, and your E is not going to be on all the time. So this attack speed buff is definitely pretty meaningful and will help his clear speed quite a bit. As far as his actual laning, it'll help some as well. You'll get slightly better trading off. That's cool. I think anything that pushes Wukong slightly away from being a one-shot assassin and pushes him towards being more useful overall as a champion, I think is a positive. You know, having some more fighter tendencies, right, I think is good. I mean, that's really what the E and Q are supposed to be able to do, is give you attack speed, give you armor shred, let you train down a champion, but really all anyone does is try to one-shot people. So I am glad that his pattern is moving away from assassin personally. And so they're going that way a little bit more. That seems fine. Next up, some fairly big nerfs to Yorick. He's losing some early and mid-game champion damage on his ghouls. Keep in mind that these ghouls do have a 30% total AD ratio from Yorick, so seeing that, oh, the ghouls only gain 1 damage, well, they gain more than that because Yorick is just giving them damage in and of itself. So here is the table of ghoul damage. In the real world, the caveat being that, of course, York is going to buy real attack damage, things like a Titanic Hydra, things like a Trinity Force, and thus alleviating this nerf somewhat. But this is the base damage of his York ghouls at levels 1 through 18. Yep, the ghouls really get to 148 attack damage, 143. It's quite high, right? Because you gain 11 attack damage per level, and you gain your like 1.5 from York gaining AD, and yep, those things scale really hard. So yeah, still a trough in the mid game around level 7. You're down 12 damage per ghoul. I want to point out, by the way, that ghouls also gain attack speed per level. And so in the early game, ghouls have very, very low attack speed. In the late game, ghouls attack roughly twice as fast as they used to. What this means is the percentage won't change as far as the actual like DPS of the ghouls, because the numbers for the attack speed didn't change. But the raw values of how much damage the ghouls really deal per second are even further backloaded, because they not only hit harder and increasingly harder, but they hit faster and increasingly faster. So said in another way, generally speaking, the amount of damage, the amount of Yorick's kit damage coming from his ghouls grows over time. So 24% less ghoul damage at level 6 is a lot less important than 24% less damage from ghouls at level 16, if that makes sense. Either way, at the end of the day, York is an exceptionally strong champion, 53.5% win rate. I actually looked at his win rate based on MMR. Seems to be flat kind of across the board, that bronze, gold, diamond, etc. are all kind of similar. So York is not really, even though it was said in the quick notes from what I saw in public data, did not really seem to be very win rate driven, or elo driven as far as win rate. Maybe I'm missing something, but it's not what I saw. Either way, it will still be a damage cut to York, and he'll still remain, I think, far above 50%. Next up, a change to Tarek. His adaptive stat is now attack damage until you buy ability power. Their reasoning is that it should actually benefit him because he auto-attacks so much. I'm not sure if that's true. Certainly, I think it will nerf him in ranged matchups because he'll be taking Zyra poke and wanting to heal and shield people, and not having ability power will mean he's worse at that. But that said, if he's just doing resolve into inspiration, it just won't matter at all because there is no adaptive damage. So I don't think this means very much. Either way, he's a 52% win rate champion. He'll remain very strong. I'm sure Tarek's going to be fine. Next up, we have actual math again, and it's Stormrazor getting an update. They are trying to dial back the upfront damage to make it less of an assassin item, which would nerf things like Yorick and Wukong. So the crit, instead of starting at 160, starts at 140. Though still plateaus at 30% crit chance, so Rapid Fire Cannon still gets you up to 2x. They're giving it less attack damage, and they're giving it more attack speed. So first off is the item efficiency of Stormrazor itself. This is 814 before it got cheaper, 815 which we were on, and then 817 is the one coming up. You can see that essentially it's still the very cheap item, and the actual gold efficiency is even higher actually, if you consider attack speed worth the gold it costs, which I think you should. Slightly higher gold efficiency. Of course, keep in mind the bonus crit goes from 1.6 to 1.4. So as a first item, it is arguably less efficient just because of that. Once you finish Rapid Fire Cannon, though, it is arguably back and awesome again. Okay, there's that part of it. It is still a very gold efficient item. You are paying for the stats, and then it also has a unique passive. The next thing is the crit chance of the item in quotes, right? So again, 1.6 to 1.4. Here's the damage percentage of your actual damage coming out. So if you're just trying to burst people with the item, the left-hand side column right here, the 88%, right? This item now gives you 12% less damage on your first stab, which is a meaningful cut, obviously. And that's what it means for Wukong and Rengar, and Kha'Zix and all that. On the other side here, I screwed up the math here, forgive me, but it's how much crit chance, quote unquote, does the item actually give you. Obviously before it gave you between 60 and 70% crit chance on your first strike, and now it gives you between 40 and 70% crit chance on your first strike, which is 20, 13, 7% off the item. It's just kind of the same things listed a different way. It's not all that important. Either way, this item is still very gold efficient, is less good on assassins, remains good on marksmen. Great. It does, by the way, nerf the first item power spike of marksman in general. I would generally consider this to be a nerf at 1 item and then a buff at 2 items. Next up, more assassin burst going down. Duskblade losing 0 to 50 off of its Duskblade damage. It's a pretty substantial cut, but it's gaining 3 lethality. And so the question is, and I want you to kind of guess, I don't believe you've seen the numbers yet, how much damage does your kit need to deal for this to be a buff? Because obviously losing 50 damage is a pretty big deal. How much do you think your kit needs to deal in total damage, Duskblade included to be fair, for 3 lethality to make up for it? And I want you to guess how much burst you have to deal between Duskblade procs for this to matter. Okay? Have a number in your head. It's this much damage. So this is how much damage the Duskblade auto does in and of itself. Now, I did not include the physical auto attack and the attack damage itself. It's just the proc damage. In the real world, right, it's really not 20% less damage because you're doing like 250 versus 220 to the actual hit, but this is just sort of how much less damage the actual trigger deals. And then over here, I chose the most played single champion in League of Legends, according to the data that was publicly available, which was Jhin. Jhin in at least ranked games or whatever. Jhin has a lot of plays. Jhin is a very popular champion, and he's a typical squishy, right? He scales up to like 80-ish armor, seems reasonable. So I said, okay, if you're fighting Jhin, and you have 18 versus 22 lethality, how much damage are you doing before and after? And essentially, you used to do 10% more damage, and now you do 13% more damage, roughly. Said in another way, the 3 lethality is worth 1.8% more damage. So you do 1.8% more physical damage, but you do somewhere between 20 and 50 less damage on the actual stab because Duskblade. So what does that take to equalize? And right over here on the far right is between 1100 and 2700 total kit damage. Now keep in mind, this is 1100, 2700 pre-mitigation damage. If your tooltips read this high, which to be honest, in a lot of cases, that's going to happen. That's going to be there for you. It is not that hard to have 1100 tooltip damage as a level 8 Talon. That's fairly reasonable. So in general, not that hard. And then when you get to level 18, okay, it requires twice as much. It's now 2700 overall front-loaded damage. But considering that if you're an assassin and your goal is to one-shot someone with like 80 armor, 2700 damage is kind of what it takes to kill a squishy. So if you're going to 100 to 0 someone, you're still doing that. If you are only trading and getting out, it's less good, which I think is a positive. So there's that. There's that math. Summoner spell configuration update. If you haven't played in a while, they're going to reset the heal ghost. K. Some small bug fixes. Phantom Dancer, it now gives you the actual move speed. Akali's Arc do more or less damage based on what you are hitting. The sound effects line up better for Maokai. Great. Cool. Nami has a weird animation bug. More skins coming out. High Noon, Urgot, Thresh, and Lucian all look super, super cool. Divine Sword, Aurelia, and Talon look super cool. Chromas for Lee Sin plus 4 of those new champions. All looks pretty sweet. That's going to be the patch rundown. It's a pretty small patch. So short, no TLDR. Thanks for watching. See you next time.